The typical American household earns $84,000 a year. That same household owes over $100,000 in debt. They need $117,000 in income to afford the median home. Half of all working-age adults have little to nothing saved for retirement. And yet, more Americans than ever are quietly becoming millionaires. Something strange is happening. The financial reality of America in 2026 is splitting into two completely different stories. On one side, millions of households are being crushed by debt payments, locked out of homeownership, and watching their paychecks disappear before anything gets saved. On the other side, millions of households are building wealth faster than any generation before them, crossing that $1 million net worth mark through home equity, retirement accounts, and long-term investing. Same economy, two completely different experiences. Here's what determines which side you end up on. Understanding the real numbers. Not the headlines about billionaires or the horror stories about poverty. The actual statistics that apply to typical Americans living typical lives. Because once you see where the average person stands on income, debt, housing, and retirement, you start to understand both the problems and the solutions. You start making smarter moves. You stop comparing yourself to extremes and start building a strategy that actually works. Let's break down the shocking financial stats that define life for the typical American in 2026. Income is where most people start. It's the number we compare at dinner parties and stress about in private. And the headline figure sounds reasonable. Median household income in the United States sits at roughly $84,000. Half of households earn more, half earn less. But that single number hides a more important pattern. Income changes dramatically throughout your life. Early career looks nothing like peak earning years. And what you make at 65 looks nothing like what you made at 45. Here's how it actually breaks down by age of the household head. Households under 25 bring in roughly $38,000 to $42,000 a year. This reflects entry-level jobs, part-time work, people still figuring things out. Nothing surprising here. By 25 to 34, median household income jumps to around $62,000 to $66,000. Careers start gaining traction. Dual incomes become more common. From 35 to 44, income climbs to about $78,000 to $85,000 annually. These are the years when earning potential starts approaching its ceiling for most people. Peak earnings hit between 45 and 54. The typical household in this range earns roughly $88,000 to $95,000 a year. After that, income starts tapering. From 55 to 64, households earn approximately $80,000 to $86,000. Some people are downshifting. Others are positioning for retirement. And for households 65 and older, median income drops to about $55,000 to $62,000 annually, a mix of Social Security, pensions, and continued work. Here's what jumps out from this data. Even in peak earning years, the typical American household is not making six figures. They're getting close, but they're not there. That becomes critically important when you start layering in housing costs, debt payments, childcare, healthcare, and the expectation that people should also be saving for retirement. At $85,000 a year, there isn't much margin. Now let's look at what these households are actually spending. Spending follows a predictable life pattern. It ramps up through midlife as housing, transportation, kids, and daily expenses pile on. Then it eases as people approach retirement and obligations start falling away. Households under 25 typically spend around $28,000 to $32,000 a year. Lower income, smaller households, fewer long-term obligations. From 25 to 34, spending jumps to about $55,000 to $60,000 annually. Housing costs rise. Lifestyles expand. Between 35 and 44, typical spending reaches roughly $70,000 to $75,000 a year. Peak spending hits from 45 to 54 at around $78,000 to $83,000 annually. After that, costs ease slightly. From 55 to 64, households spend about $68,000 to $72,000. Kids leave home. Some expenses decline. And households 65 and older typically spend roughly $50,000 to $54,000 per year. These numbers represent cost of living only: housing, transportation, utilities, food, clothing, healthcare. They don't include savings or investment contributions. So when you see that the typical midlife household spends $80,000 a year just to exist, that's before a single dollar goes toward retirement accounts, emergency funds, or building wealth. If you're earning $85,000 and spending $80,000, you have $5,000 of margin for the entire year. That's $400 a month for everything else. This is why so many people feel stuck, even when their income sounds decent on paper. Now let's talk about the part nobody wants to face: debt. Americans owe more money than ever before. Total household debt hit $18.8 trillion by the end of 2025, a record high. The average household carries roughly $105,000 in total debt across mortgages, auto loans, student loans, and credit cards. Credit card debt alone reached $1.28 trillion, also a record. The average household with credit card debt owes about $11,000. The average interest rate on those cards sits around 21%. For cards actively accruing interest, it's closer to 23%. Here's the math that should terrify everyone. If you carry the average credit card balance of $11,000 at the average interest rate of 23% and only make minimum payments, you will pay nearly $18,500 in interest alone. It will take 22 years to pay off. By the time you're done, you'll have paid nearly $30,000 to eliminate $11,000 of debt. And 47% of credit card holders carry a balance month to month. 26% of them only make the minimum payment. Think about that. A quarter of people with credit card debt are on the 22-year plan. They're paying interest on interest on interest while their balances barely move. The causes aren't surprising. 41% of people with credit card debt cite emergency expenses: medical bills, car repairs, home repairs, unexpected costs. Another 33% point to everyday expenses like groceries, childcare, and utilities. Only 10% blame retail purchases. This isn't a story about people buying luxury goods they can't afford. It's a story about people using credit cards to survive because their income doesn't stretch far enough. Debt burden varies by age, and it peaks exactly when you'd expect. For people under 25, the debt-to-income ratio runs about 15 to 20%, mostly student loans and credit cards. From 25 to 34, it rises to 18 to 25%. Mortgages enter the picture alongside auto loans. Between 35 and 44, debt strain intensifies to 20 to 28%. Peak borrowing years. The highest debt burden hits from 45 to 54, roughly 22 to 30% of income going toward debt payments. This is the squeeze point. Mortgages still active, kids potentially in college, retirement looming, and debt eating a third of every paycheck. After 54, debt starts declining. By 65 and older, most people are down to 8 to 15%. Financial planners flag anything above 36% as dangerous. But even at 25 to 30%, you feel the pressure. Cash flow is tight, saving feels impossible. Every unexpected expense goes on a credit card, which makes next month even tighter. The Federal Reserve tracks household debt payments as a percentage of disposable income. The most recent figure is 11.3%. That sounds manageable until you realize it means the average American spends roughly $1 out of every $9 earned just servicing existing debt. For households with above average debt loads, it's closer to $1 out of every $4. Working a full week and giving Thursday's paycheck entirely to debt payments. Now let's talk about the silent killer: inflation. The official inflation rate has cooled to around 2.4% annually. That sounds reasonable, normal even. But here's what that number doesn't tell you. Inflation is cumulative. Once prices go up, they rarely come back down. The inflation rate measures how fast prices are rising right now. It doesn't measure how much higher prices already are compared to a few years ago. Since 2020, cumulative inflation has reached approximately 25%. That means something that cost $100 in early 2020 now costs $125. Groceries alone are up roughly 25 to 30% compared to pre-pandemic levels. Housing costs jumped even more. Rents rose 20 to 30% in many markets. Home prices climbed 30 to 40%, and mortgage rates doubled from around 3% to 6 or 7%, which in many cases doubled monthly payments for new buyers. Utilities are running 20 to 30% higher than a few years ago. Insurance quietly exploded. Auto insurance increased 30 to 50% or more in many states. Homeowners insurance jumped 20 to 40%. The current inflation rate might look normal on paper, but the cost of living doesn't feel normal because we're operating on a permanently higher baseline. Here's a simple way to understand it. If your household spent $60,000 a year before 2020, that same lifestyle now costs $72,000 to $75,000. If your income didn't increase by the same amount, you're effectively poorer, even if your paycheck looks the same. The people who feel inflation most intensely are those exposed to rising costs across every category. Renters who face annual increases, people financing newer vehicles at higher rates, anyone whose income didn't keep pace. The people most insulated are those who locked in big expenses years ago. Fixed-rate mortgages from 2020 or 2021, paid off vehicles they keep driving. Their housing costs stayed flat while everyone else's doubled. This is one reason the financial divide is widening. Some households locked in low costs before inflation hit. Others are paying 2026 prices on 2019 wages. Housing is where this divide becomes most dramatic. The median home price sits around $405,000 to $415,000. Meanwhile, median household income is roughly $84,000. Home prices are now 5 times the median household income, near historic highs. To comfortably afford the median home at current prices and mortgage rates, households typically need income closer to $110,000 to $120,000. That's 40 to 50% more than what the typical household actually earns. According to the National Association of Home Builders, roughly 75% of American households cannot afford a median-priced new home. 3 out of 4 families are priced out. The monthly payment shift tells the story most clearly. Back in 2020, a median-priced home with a 3% mortgage meant payments around $1,300 to $1,400 a month. Today, with higher prices and mortgage rates around 6.5%, that same home costs roughly $2,600 monthly, nearly double, in just a few years. For young adults especially, homeownership has become increasingly unreachable. The median age of homebuyers has climbed to 59. The share of first-time buyers has dropped by roughly 50% since 2007. This matters because housing has historically been the primary wealth-building tool for American families. The typical homeowner has a median net worth of roughly $400,000. The typical renter has a median net worth of about $10,000 to $15,000. That's a 25 to 40 times difference in wealth. And it persists even among people 65 and older. Part of this comes from home appreciation over time. Part comes from mortgage payoff acting as forced savings. Every payment builds equity whether you think about it or not. For many retirees, their home represents the single largest asset they own, and going into retirement with a paid-off mortgage means one of their biggest expenses disappears entirely. Buying a home isn't right for everyone, but the data is overwhelming. Home ownership remains one of the most reliable paths to building wealth in America. Those locked out of housing are locked out of that path. Now let's look at retirement. This is where the numbers get alarming. Roughly 40 to 45% of households approaching retirement have less than $100,000 saved in retirement accounts. 1 in 4 working-age adults has no retirement savings at all. The Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances shows that over half of American households have no dedicated retirement savings whatsoever. Meanwhile, financial advisors estimate that the typical retiree needs around $1.26 million to retire comfortably. The median retirement savings for people aged 55 to 64 is only about $185,000. For those 65 to 74, it's roughly $200,000. That's a massive gap. The average 401k balance tells a somewhat more optimistic story, around $144,000 across all participants as of late 2025. But averages get skewed by high balances at the top. Medians are far lower. Here's how retirement savings actually break down by age, according to Fidelity data. Workers in their 20s have an average 401k balance around $30,000. By the 30s, that grows to roughly $80,000 to $90,000. In the 40s, average balances reach around $150,000 to $170,000. By the 50s, averages climb to roughly $250,000 to $300,000. And in the 60s, average 401k balances hit around $210,000 to $250,000. These numbers might sound reasonable until you consider that retirement could last 25 to 30 years. A $250,000 nest egg provides roughly $10,000 per year before Social Security. Now let's look at the flip side. While a large group is struggling, another large group is quietly building real wealth. The median household net worth in America is approximately $193,000. The average is over $1 million, though that's heavily skewed by wealthy households at the top. Here's how median net worth breaks down by age. Under 35, about $39,000. 35 to 44, roughly $136,000. 45 to 54, around $247,000. 55 to 64, approximately $365,000. 65 to 74, about $410,000. 75 and older, roughly $336,000. Wealth builds steadily through working years, peaks around retirement age, then starts declining as people live off their savings. What's encouraging is that median net worth has actually increased 37% since 2019, the largest jump since tracking began. And that growth wasn't limited to the ultra-wealthy. Middle-class households saw significant gains too, primarily through home equity appreciation and rising retirement account values. A record number of households have crossed the $1 million net worth threshold in recent years. Not through inheritance or lottery wins, through consistent investing, home equity growth, and time. Social Security plays a crucial role in this picture. The average Social Security retirement benefit in 2026 is approximately $2,071 per month, or about $25,000 annually. That reflects a 2.8% cost of living adjustment for 2026. For couples where both spouses receive benefits, combined monthly income averages just over $3,200. Here's what stands out about Social Security reliance. Roughly 54% of retirees receive at least half their income from Social Security. About 1 in 4 retirees relies on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. Two very different groups exist within those numbers. Some retirees rely heavily on Social Security because they never had opportunity to save. Lower wages, unstable employment, emergencies that wiped out savings. For them, that $2,500 monthly is everything. It means a tight, paycheck-to-paycheck retirement. Others rely heavily on Social Security by choice. They had strong earnings, accumulated solid benefits, and used Social Security strategically to delay touching their investments. For a married couple with robust work histories, combined Social Security could reach $6,000 monthly or more. Same reliance percentage, completely different financial realities. Social Security was never designed to fully replace your working income. On average, it replaces about 40% of pre-retirement earnings. Financial planners estimate retirees need 70 to 80% income replacement to maintain their lifestyle. The gap between 40% and 75% is supposed to come from savings, investments, pensions, or continued work. For households without those supplemental sources, Social Security becomes the whole picture. And $25,000 a year is a difficult way to live. There's another concern looming. The Social Security trust funds are projected to be depleted around 2033 unless Congress acts. If that happens, benefits wouldn't disappear, but they would be reduced to about 77% of current scheduled payments. A $2,000 monthly benefit would drop to roughly $1,540. Most analysts expect Congress will intervene before that happens, but the clock is ticking, and the uncertainty adds stress to retirement planning. Another major shift involves when people actually retire. For decades, the average retirement age hovered around 62 to 63. Today, it's moved closer to 64 to 65 and continues trending upward. Even more striking, labor force participation among people 65 to 69 has risen sharply over the past 20 years. Participation among those 70 to 74 has more than doubled. Millions of Americans are working well into their 60s and 70s, some because they need the income, others because work provides structure, purpose, and connection. What we're seeing is retirement being redefined. Rather than a hard stop, many people are gliding into retirement, reducing hours, shifting to consulting, transitioning gradually rather than walking away completely. The statistics on longevity make this more important. When people quote life expectancy, they usually mention 78 years. That's life expectancy at birth. But if you've already made it to 65, the numbers change. At 65, the average man can expect to live another 18 to 19 years, to roughly 83 or 84. The average woman at 65 can expect another 20 to 21 years, to approximately 85 or 86. And those are averages. About 1 in 3 men who reach 65 will live to 90 or beyond. About 1 in 2 women will live past 90. For couples, the numbers are more dramatic. There's roughly a 50 to 60% chance that at least one spouse in a typical 65-year-old couple will live into their 90s. About a 25% chance one will reach 95 or older. Living together, checking on each other, taking care of each other, it extends both lives. This means retirement could last 25, 30, even 35 years. Anyone planning for a 15-year retirement is potentially setting themselves up for trouble. You don't want to run out of money before you run out of life. So what do all these statistics actually mean for you? Here are the practical takeaways. First, use typical as a benchmark, then aim to beat it. The median numbers give you a realistic picture of where the average household stands. Look at the figures for your age group, income, net worth, retirement savings, and set your goals slightly higher. You don't need to be exceptional. You just need to be slightly better than average consistently over time. Small gaps between what you earn and what you spend create massive long-term results when invested. Second, make eliminating high-interest debt your top priority. The data shows debt is squeezing typical American households. Credit card debt at 23% interest destroys wealth faster than almost anything else. Every dollar you're paying in interest is a dollar not going toward your future. The faster you escape high-interest debt, the faster your entire financial picture changes. Third, lock in big expenses when possible. Inflation permanently raised the cost of living, but the people feeling it least are those who locked in housing costs years ago. If buying a home makes sense for your situation, a fixed-rate mortgage provides long-term protection against rising housing costs. Keeping vehicles as long as possible after they're paid off avoids constantly resetting to higher prices. Stability in expenses often matters more than chasing slightly higher income. Fourth, understand that housing, when feasible, is still a powerful wealth-building tool. You don't need a dream home. A starter home works. The data shows a 25 to 40 times wealth gap between homeowners and renters. That gap comes from appreciation plus mortgage payoff acting as forced savings. For households who can make it work, homeownership remains one of the most reliable paths to building net worth. Fifth, don't rely on Social Security alone, but don't ignore it either. Understand what your benefit will be. Build savings to bridge the gap between Social Security and what you'll actually need. The typical retiree gets about $25,000 annually from Social Security. If you need $60,000 to maintain your lifestyle, you need another $35,000 from somewhere. Sixth, plan for a longer retirement than you expect. A 20-year retirement was once standard. Now 30 years is increasingly common. Make sure your money is designed to last. Keep growth investments in your portfolio even in retirement. Build flexibility into your withdrawal strategy. Finally, recognize that consistent habits determine which side of the divide you end up on. Some households quietly build wealth over time. Others slowly fall behind. The difference usually isn't income, it's behavior. Investing regularly, even small amounts. Owning assets when possible. Controlling debt aggressively. Living below your means even when income increases. These habits compound over decades into completely different financial outcomes. Two Americas are emerging from the same economy. One is drowning in debt, locked out of housing, watching retirement slip further away. The other is building equity, growing investments, and approaching the future with options instead of anxiety. The statistics don't determine which America you end up in. Your decisions do. The typical American carries $105,000 in debt, earns $84,000 a year, can't afford the median home, and has far less saved for retirement than they'll need. But the typical American who makes different choices, who attacks debt aggressively, who prioritizes saving over spending, who finds ways to own assets instead of renting them, builds wealth that compounds year after year until they're no longer typical at all. The numbers in this video aren't meant to discourage you. They're meant to show you exactly where the average person stands so you can make choices that put you somewhere better. Median net worth at 65 is $410,000. Average is $1.8 million. The difference between those numbers is decades of consistent decisions that most people didn't make. You can be one of the ones who does.